The head of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, has warned that there is a 25% risk of global growth dropping below 2% next year, and that slowing growth in China is particularly concerning. So what has been the impact of China's zero-COVID policy on the economy thus far? What have been the implications of China's stringent pandemic containment on South Korea's economy? And what are the prospects of a prompt rebound in the Chinese economy once its COVID strategy is eased? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we revisit the global economic challenges of China's pandemic restrictions and related protests. For more, I have Professor Kim Sei-wan at Ewha Womans University. Professor Kim, it's good to have you with us.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
I also have Mr. Jeff Moon, the head of China Moon Strategies and former U.S. Assistant Trade Representative for China. Mr. Moon, it's a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Right. Professor Kim, we start with you. The IMF, as I mentioned earlier, says there is rising risk of global growth dropping below 2% next year, and that the world has reportedly only experienced such dismal growth a total of 5 times since the 1970s. That being said, Professor Kim, let's begin with a few words on our past experiences of low global growth.
Last Thursday, IMF Chief Georgieva warned that the chance of global growth dropping below 2% is increasing as major economies slow. In previous economic growth forecast for next year in October, IMF has expected that next year's global economic growth would be around 2.7%. But according to IMF chief's new speech last week, IMF will adjust next year's global growth down to 1% level. It means that global economy quickly cools down from this year's 3% growth level to 1% growth next year. Actually, 1% level economic growth indicates a very rare, serious economic recession. Below 2% global economic growth is last seen during the coronavirus outbreak year of 2020 and global financial crisis of 2009. We still remember how much we suffered from 0% growth in 2009 and negative 3% growth in 2020. Actually, IMF's growth forecast for next year is worse than that of OECD's most recent global economic growth forecast for next year at 2.2%. It is also expected that US and Eurozone's economic growth for next year would be about only 0.5% for next year. But if both of China and India's economic growth exceeds 5%, global economy would be soft landing with higher than 2% growth.
I see. And despite those hopes, though, the IMF, Mr. Moon, has also claimed that slowing growth in China is particularly concerning. Now, simply speaking, then, what have been the most tangible economic consequences of China's zero-COVID policy, Mr. Moon?
Well, even before COVID, the Chinese economy had been slowing down for the past decade due to rising wages and other factors, fewer workers due to the aging population, an unsustainable business model in the real estate sector, which accounts for about a third of the economy. What COVID did was it resulted in arbitrary lockdowns and travel restrictions, preventing economic activity in the manufacturing and service sectors, and creating shortages that increased inflation. As a result, the economy is now growing at the slowest pace it's experienced in about 3 decades, which was reflected in the latest official purchasing managers index statistics that were issued just last week in China. And those statistics showed that the economy contracted for the 7th straight month. Foreign firms have also been impacted because employees have been quarantined and people are unable to travel to and from China. So many foreign firms have decided that the Chinese supply chain lacks sufficient resilience, and they're relocating some or all of their operations. Apple, for example, has announced that it's going to be moving some operations to India, Vietnam, and perhaps elsewhere because it can't produce sufficient product in China. And wait times for iPhones, for example, in the US are now more than an unprecedented 30 days, which means that deliveries of those goods may be delayed until after the crucial Christmas season.
Right, and talking about foreign firms, Professor Kim, what has been the impact of China's stringent pandemic restrictions on South Korea?
China's strict action on containing COVID pandemic provides a serious impact on Korean economy. I would say that one of the largest victims of Beijing's zero COVID policy is Korean economy. Chinese economy and Korean economies are highly intertwined in global production chain. For example, as Mr. Moon pointed out, Korea provides high-tech parts to China, like semiconductor and OLED panel, and Chinese companies produce final products like smartphone, which is iPhone. And China also covers almost a quarter of Korean trades. South Korea's export in November suffered their worst annual drop in 2.5 years, hurt by Beijing's zero COVID policy and shutdowns of big cities. Particularly, Korean semiconductor industry is hit hard by China's cooling demands in memory chips. A resurgence in COVID-19 infections in China and Beijing's continuous zero COVID policy helped to decrease Korea's export to China by 26% on year in November. Thanks to huge drop in export to China, semiconductor export, which is Korea's #1 export item, also dropped by 30% on year in November.
Right, and Mr. Moon, surely Chinese President Xi Jinping is very well aware of the severe economic repercussions of his COVID-19 containment strategy. That being said, why is he unwilling to relent, do you think?
I think that there are several factors at play here. One is just the public health risk. The Shanghai Journal of Preventive Medicine published a paper last month that predicted that if COVID restrictions were relaxed significantly, there would be more than 2 million deaths and more than 200 million infections. And then that leads to another factor, which is the economic impact of all of that. Nearly a third of China's population is employed in the manufacturing sector. So that possible increase in cases could have a dramatic effect on the economy. Another factor is nationalism. Xi Jinping has cited China's COVID response and the relatively low number of deaths so far as evidence of the superiority of the Chinese communist system. He's promoted the false narrative that China is rising and the West is falling, which perhaps also explains why he refuses to permit the world's most effective vaccines, all of which are from the West, from being used in China. And then finally, the governing philosophy in China is at play. In China, the central government is at the heart of China's state-led economy. Chinese leaders are used to controlling and planning all economic activity, so the natural instinct of Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders is to retain control of all economic activity to the maximum extent possible, hence the dramatic steps that they've taken under the zero COVID policy.
Right. And adding on to what Mr. Moon has said, Professor Kim, some pundits believe that Mr. Xi Jinping remains resolute regarding his pandemic restrictions, that is, because he is confident about a quick rebound in the Chinese economy once COVID-19 is contained. Do you share his confidence?
Well, that is a possible scenario, but I don't 100% agree that Chinese economy will recover fast as soon as Beijing lifts restrictions on COVID pandemic. Chinese economy is facing several structural economic problems, like bubbles in real estate market, even before COVID pandemic. As we have seen in the recent bankruptcy of Evergrande, which is one of the largest real estate developers in China, a single Chinese developer bankruptcy of developer could be a trigger to global financial market panic. So bubble burst in Chinese real estate market can't be taken lightly. The real estate market industry covers a quarter of Chinese GDP, and mortgage loan in China covers 30% of all commercial banks loan. Also, the real estate industry in China is highly related to raw materials, construction, and consumer spending. Quite a few economists agree that the collapse of Chinese real estate market could be a systematic risk of Chinese economy as a whole. So without soft landings in several economic problems of real estate market, marginal public corporations, corruption, and so on, Beijing will face a difficult time after the end of COVID pandemic.
Right, I see. And against that backdrop, Mr. Moon, some economists believe that public protests in China may lead to a rather disorderly exit from its stringent COVID-19 strategy. What would be the broader implications of such an exit, Mr. Moon, and how do you envision this current situation in China playing out?
The top priority of China's leaders is to maintain domestic stability. We've already talked about economic stability, but political stability is even more important to the Communist Party because its power depends on maintaining political control. In Chinese history, peasant rebellions were the key factor that led to the fall of dynasties, and extended civil wars lasting more than a decade led to lengthy periods of instability and poverty in the mid-1800s and early 1900s. So Chinese leaders are well aware of that history, which is why the Communist Party surveils, controls, or bans any independent social movements, including popular organizations and even religion. So many observers have compared the recent popular protests in China to the Tiananmen protests in 1989, but there are many other analogies in Chinese history, which is why the Communist Party is taking the political implications of these recent protests very seriously and has even relaxed some of the restrictions in order to relieve some of the political pressure that they now perceive.
Right, understood. Professor Kim, against this backdrop then of uncertainty as we head into the new year, what are your words of advice to the government here on the local front with regard to its economic endeavors next year?
We say that government is not a Santa Claus. That means government policies are not all-purpose solution under difficult situation expected next year. Particularly high inflation and global economic recessions are not generated by domestic factors. So for Korean government, there are clear limits in controlling inflation and economic downturn next year. Nevertheless, it is very important for Korean government to prioritize policy targets. For example, the base interest rate target would be different depending on policy target. If government's top priority goes to stabilizing inflation, the base interest rate should be much higher than that of 3.25% of now. However, the top priority is on recovering economic growth and employment. The base interest rate hike should be stopped as soon as possible. Also, in deciding what to do on interest rate, tax, government expenditure, there could be too much political consideration, which misleads Korean economy in a not right way. So every single policy decision of government should be explained in terms of pros and cons of expected policy result to people.
Right, a transparent approach then. Mr. Moon, I believe we have time for one more question now. India, I believe, is hoping to replace China as the factory of the world. That being said, what are the prospects of this particular reality in the future, very briefly speaking?
China is unique not only because it's a large country with a large labor pool, but also because it has developed a unique manufacturing ecosystem. China has not just relatively low costs and large scale, but it also has a network of suppliers. It has physical infrastructure and talents that can accommodate the needs of foreign companies. And China also has a growing middle class that can not just produce, but also consume some of those projects. Some businesses definitely going to relocate to India and elsewhere, but building a competitive manufacturing infrastructure will take time. India is a world leader in software development, but its physical infrastructure, including its roads, its airports, its power grid, are no match really for China's. And India has a regulatory system that can be quite chaotic. So those limitations explain why India's manufacturing output is currently just 1/10 of that of China. And I think that India has promise, but there's a lot of work to do before India can become the factory of the world.
Right, I see. All right, then, Mr. Moon, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. And Professor Kim, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time on Tuesday.